and I'm going to read Chapter 1, Respirator and Silver Swans' Mother. It's called Full Circle. It was Friday. The day unfolded much like any other day. A young elder named Muskwa moved about her day following her business schedule. Most people Muskwa's age were focused on retirement, dreaming of their last day of work and its transportation into a sedentary way of living. She noted people believed in the land of milk and honey, a place where there would be no more work, no more money worries, a pension to support their travels, and future luxuries. The meaning of retirement meant something different to her. She had simply withdrawn from her professional career to follow her dream on her own terms. Since her departure from employment, she had discovered a renewed joy in her own creativity. Each day she looked forward to her office where her memoirs developed into pages which began to show promise. When she was in her art studio, she felt shrouded by creativity. It called to her soul, and she acknowledged it as a spirit spark, a universal ingredient to help motivate herself and others to become the best version of themselves. On this particular day, Muskwa's writing took her into her residential school experience, and the memory had slowed her down. She struggled emotionally to continue writing. She acknowledged how vulnerable she was at 9 years old, and the feelings of abandonment that came from an experience so long ago. While she was deeply immersed in translation of the feelings into words on paper, anger surfaced. Muskwa was appalled at the magnitude of genocidal destruction on her people. First, the religious indoctrination to kill the Indian in the child through a series of spiritual, mental, and emotional, physical, and sexual abuses in a school setting. She imagined her mother leaving the residential school at 16 years old with bottled up, untold truths. Muskwa was told her mother entered residential school at the age of 9 years old until she became 16 years old. A lot of years went by, and the three monkeys, see no evil, hear no evil, and feel no evil, seemed a fitting analogy of her mother's survival of the residential school system. At 16 years old, her mother was free to leave the school and to go back home into her own community. She arrived home with 3 monkeys of silence on her shoulders that would eventually begin to rob her mother's mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, and psychological forces. Holding secrets meant finding a way to forget. Eventually, her mother's active role in life would be whittled down to the alcohol. There were warning signs along the way as Muskwa was growing up, but nothing could prepare her for her mother's loss of her father, who passed away one morning in early June from stomach cancer. What followed was her mother's increased desire to drink, and many days Muskwa remembered the empty house, watching her own dad, Stone Man, pace the floor with worry in his heart. The year Red Tree's father passed away would be the same year her parents separated and her mother obtained custody. Muskwa and her late brother were placed into residential schooling that fall. Muskwa remembered the day clearly. It was Halloween when her father found out they had been placed in the school. Muskwa straightened her dress. She repositioned herself on her chair. She acknowledged forgiveness. She would change that bitterness and mix it with the sweet love of spirit and allow old wounds like this one to flow into the ocean of love and mercy. She took a deep breath, filled her mind with love. Then she enveloped all her resentful thoughts in white light. Closing her eyes, she brought the light into her being, and it felt so right. She was deep in space when the phone rang, and Muskwa jumped up and then answered her phone in an awkward manner. "Hello," she said with a gruff voice. The voice on the other end said, "Please sit down." Muskwa's heart skipped a beat and her adrenaline went up a notch. What? What is it? What's wrong? This would be the phone call that would change her life and tilt the axis of her world. "It's your mother. She's in ICU. You need to come home." It was all too familiar phone call, one that resonated with the loss of her brother a few years back. Muskwa fought through her tears. She was in shock. Her head felt numb, her motions robotic as she fought disbelief. It was late. A fresh snow and a high wind warning for the highway had been petitioned by the road service application, and she decided to wait and leave in the morning. The morning saw Muskwa as she sped down the highway, and a recent phone call confirmed Red Tree's prognosis went from stable to acute. With mounting grief, she stepped on the gas. Flying down January roads that were covered in thawing fresh snow was crazy, and the black on the road's shoulders became an obvious threat when her rear wheels slightly swerved and grabbed her attention. All of a sudden, she physically heard, "Let go! Let God!" As the tears cascaded down her cheeks, she saw something large move on a fence post to her right. She quickly looked, and a bald eagle lifted itself from the post into the air. The eagle swooped above the car so close that Muskwa swore she could almost touch the feathers. She acknowledged it was her mother sending a message, and then she slowed the car down. What a profound message. Bald eagles don't hang out during the winter, do they? She thought to herself. Peacefulness embraced her as she arrived and parked the car in the hospital parkade. She found her way to the intensive care unit to find her mother, Red Tree, still holding on. The next 12 hours crawled by in a blur. Nurses and doctors became a source of information, comfort, and support for Muskwa. Her mother's prognosis was dim. At first, a pancreatic infection had been diagnosed. Her symptoms had started out with high blood pressure, which now skyrocketed. In an attempt to help her breathe, she was hooked up to a breathing machine, and in the corner just behind the bed, Muskwa counted as many as 10 bags of fluid, all hooked individually to the IV rack. Such a large number of medications administered to her mother was proof of a medical team's effort to help her mother's body heal. Time slowly passed as Muskwa sat beside her mother's bed, numb and almost paralyzed with disbelief, seeing her mother here at this moment in this time. Was it a nightmare? She queried herself. Was it a nightmare? That evening, the doctor told Muskwa a decision needed to be made by her and her family. According to new medical information, a piece of Red Tree's bowel had broken off into her bloodstream, and there was nothing more the medical team could do for her. It would be time to call family and prepare for Red Tree's life to end. Muskwa felt empty and devoid of feelings. She didn't know what to think, and the feeling of freaking out overwhelmed her. She resisted the urge to scream out her grief and her pain. The feeling of helplessness cascaded over her as she prepared for her mother's translation into the afterlife. She sat holding her mother's right hand, watching her mother's chest rise and fall. Tracing the veins on her mother's hand, Muskwa was taken to a memory of her childhood when she was 4 years old. She was busy running her small fingers over her mother's hands, tracing the veins. Oh, how deeply she loved her mom. From her memory, she heard Red Tree say, "Stop that! You're going to shorten my life." Muskwa understood her mother's reaction later on in her adulthood as some suspicious cultural belief. In reaction to the memory, she said aloud, "Pfft." A noise sounded. Beep! A nurse entered the ICU to recalibrate the machine where the medicines were being dispensed into her mother. No movement, just the sound of the breathing machine, which was doing the breathing for her mother. Muskwa's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the screen that monitored her mother's blood pressure, heartbeat, and vital organs. Her eyes became fixed on the wavy green line, the yellow and red alternation of wave signals. Muskwa shifted in her chair, breathing deeply, wiping the tears from her face. She relaxed for a moment and more memories flooded into her consciousness. She saw herself and her mother in a social worker's office. They were signing adoption forms to give away Muskwa's newly born daughter to a very good family. Arriving at the final decision had been heartbreaking for both the women, and here they were sitting at the desk staring at the documents in front of them. Internally, Muskwa sobbed. Her body was numb as feelings resonated with the loss she felt holding her mother's hand. From the past, she recalled summoning the courage to get through the emotional turmoil. In that lifetime of her past story, she recalled the tears and how they pooled behind her eyelids, threatening to release down her cheeks. How she held her breath to block the emotional breakdown without passing out was a mystery. All she wanted was to be strong for God, because at that moment there was nothing else. Muskwa didn't know where she learned to do this, but she shifted her attention onto an object to ground herself and then shut down the cascade of emotions. Above their heads was a sterling silver flying bird mobile. It was moving ever so slightly. The light hitting the chrome, the smoothness of the metal, held her attention, and a feeling of peace swept over her. Gratitude filled Muskwa's heart for a brief moment as she reflected on the dragonfly child coming home. 10 years ago, she remembered reading a Sioux excerpt somewhere about adopted children looking for their parents. Was it coincidence? More dragonflies hovered near her each summer as she became closer to finding her daughter. They so reminded her of giggly little children, so colorful, they would dance and flit about her. Then, that one day, that beautiful day, Muskwa and Rainbow Woman were reunited on the telephone. Muskwa remembers sharing the experience with her mother. It brought a faint smile to her own face. The thought brought her back to the last discussion she had with Red Tree just before Christmas. How were the kids? What were the boys doing? How about the girls? And how was Rainbow Woman? The tempo of this discussion went deeper during their visit as Red Tree said, "I wish things could have been different. It was his fault," referring to an ex-husband. "If I could turn back time, we should have just taken her and made a life." Quiet had filled her mother's small apartment, and Muskwa remembered her response. "Mom, it's okay. It was meant to be this way. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. She was raised by really good people, and she's in our life now." An awareness of forgiveness in the conversation brought the feeling of peace between the both of them. Beep! The sound of the breathing machine jarred Muskwa back to the present. Through her tears, she saw her mother, Red Tree, laying there peacefully. Was there a glow on her mother's face? Or was that trickery of her own vision? Muskwa then felt her mother's presence, but it didn't come from the alcohol-ravaged body that laid on the hospital bed. Red Tree was in the room. Muskwa felt her mother's energy fill the room, and it was comforting and nurtured her senses spiritually. A strong feeling of coming full circle permeated Muskwa's senses, like the changing of seasons when birth and death connect. Breathing in the love and an ambient presence of her mother, she heard her say, "I'll always be here for you now." Muskwa realized her fear of death was really about all the losses that she had in her life, compounded over a series of time. It seemed like all her people could do after the travesty of European contact and residential schools was to quickly forget and to move on. During the times of the simulation, there was no time to take stock of life. Yet here she was taking stock of her life and her mother's, harvesting the good, the strength, and wisdom of the women in her culture in her lifetime. Muskwa grew tired and weary and crawled onto a cot made by the nurses to rest for a few minutes. As she rested, she drifted off and reflected on her second oldest son. His arrival helped her mother forget the loss of the first child. Her memories shifted back and forth from the time of the adoption and how uncanny it was to find herself making an almost similar decision about another's life, her mother's. Red Tree was closer to leaving when the nurses awakened Muskwa from the slumber of the spirit walk with her mother. Watching her mother's gradual entry into the spirit world triggered feelings and remembrances of the days when she gave birth to her children. During that time before the births, here was an intangible anticipation and the subtle excitement that entered the room. She felt this now, through the windows in her mother's hospital room. The sun began to crest the horizon, and the color gray embodied the landscape. Muskwa's grandmothers taught her that when the eagle swoops down to gather prayers, it would be during this time of the day. The nurse said, "It'll be any time now. If you wish to be with her, I'll pull up a chair for you." Muskwa moved to her mother's bedside and sat closely to her. Holding her hand, watching the lines slowly disappearing, she said to Red Tree, "I love you, Mom. Thank you for being my mother." Tears poured down her face. She saw a small movement of her mother's eyebrow. The lines on the breathing machines became smaller. A baby cried in ICU. Muskwa noticed the lines spike up on the breathing machine, then to slowly disappear. Each time the baby cried, the lines spiked up weakly and then began to fade. As her mother walked away from the equipment that held her life, the lines spiked up, illustrative of her looking back, and the gradual fading of them as she joined those on the other side. The room was unimaginably quiet. There was no drama like the movies, no crash carts, no screaming nurses or running doctors, just Muskwa and the morning sun as her mother left into the light. It was 5:58 a.m. Muskwa realized she had become a young elder within the very few minutes of her mother's death. She felt alone, with exceptions to her father, Big Rock, who is now a resident in the seniors' home. As she drove away from the hospital, it became more important than ever to share her experience and stories with the world. She refused to be oppressed. It was obvious to her now she was successful in breaking the cycles of violence within her. There was no such thing as getting life perfect, only choices, and the realization we are all here to fulfill our journey through our experiences in the Earth Walk. Thank you for joining me today. Love ya.